É assim, bem-vindos à Comic Con, bem-vindos a um BANGCAST gravado ao vivo na Comic Con. O convidado de hoje é o Joe Abercrombie, que é segunda vez no BANGCAST, outra vez via Zoom, desta vez pessoalmente. Convidámos também o Pedro Reisinho, que foi o primeiro editor do Joe Abercrombie já há muitos anos, na Gado Livro.
Sim, na Gado Livro.
E vamos falar um bocadinho de fantasia, vamos fazer perguntas. Eu gostava que vocês também pensassem em algumas perguntas, não precisam de ser perguntas espetaculares, porque façam uma pergunta e dá origem a qualquer coisa. E, first of all, welcome to Lisbon, Joe. It's your first time in Lisbon, right?
First time in Lisbon, yeah. I mean, I was here yesterday.
Okay, welcome.
Well, but that doesn't count.
Okay, great to have you.
Yeah.
We recorded a BANGCAST a couple of months ago. It was a success for our regular audiences. Was very good. And we want to talk a little bit about fantasy with you, about the movies, the TV series, what are your plans? I don't know, many questions here. We will try not to repeat the same questions because you are a very interesting person, so I think we can
Immensely interesting. If you should get the impression while watching me that I'm actually quite boring, you're wrong. I am a fascinating man.
Okay, so... first of all, what are you doing here exactly?
Here now.
Now.
Well, I'm in Portugal at the Comic-Con.
Losing the English versus France game.
Well, yeah, missing the England-France game. This is true. What's the score, by the way?
It's still 0-0.
It's still 0-0. I'm here to talk about books, really, and to sign books with people, meet readers, and prove to people that I am as interesting as I say I am. Largely that.
Okay. So...
not sure you need to prove that, but okay.
There's no harm in proving it.
So, Pedro, you want to start? You were Joe's first publisher in Portugal many years ago. And why did you publish him? It was that very first famous trilogy?
Yeah, it was the first Law trilogy with the Bloody Nine. You have 10 fingers, right?
I do.
Okay, great. If you did only have 9 fingers, I would be very worried for the health of everybody here.
It's safe.
You need to read the books to understand. So, at that time, at the publishing house I was there, at Gado Livro, we were doing a lot of fantasy, and I had 3 authors in particular that I liked very much. They were emerging authors at the time. One was Present Company, the other was Peter Viberet, and the third one, who I hate very, very much now, it's Patrick Rothfuss. And I hate him because he will never in his life end the trilogy that he started. So, Joe was... the English leg of this trilogy, and I liked very much because what he did, it was fast-paced, it was bloody, and there was not a single good person in those books. Not one. And I think it was the most similar to life itself. There is no good person, not the hero, the perfect hero, the one who conquers all, the one who does all. The anti-heroes, I think, it's the ones you play the most. And I would love to understand a bit, why did you made your hero, with big quotas, the Logan, the Bloody Nine, why did you make him such a bad character to start with?
I suppose I'd read a lot of books as a kid in which the heroes are very heroic, and the good and evil sides are very easy to tell apart. You know, I love Lord of the Rings, and I was a huge fan of Lord of the Rings when I was a kid, as I'm sure many people are. But as I read a lot more fantasy as I was growing up, I found things started to become quite predictable. You know, you had very shiny heroes, very black villains who didn't necessarily have any particularly compelling reasons. They were kind of evil for the sake of it. And at the same time, I was reading, you know, a lot of thrillers, a lot of westerns, things like L.A. Confidential, James Ellroy's books, and Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove, books of that kind. where the characters are not very clean, not very black or white. They are all a mixture of different strange motivations, living in a very grey world where there is no very clear good and evil. And I just found that kind of world quite fascinating, and I wondered why people weren't doing that more in fantasy. I mean, people have been doing that in fantasy for years, of course. Things like Conan and Fafnir and the Grey Mouse are traditional sword and sorcery. Michael Moorcock, writers like that.
And, Glenn Cook.
Glenn Cook, yeah, you know.
You publish him, it's great author.
Absolutely. And so that stuff had been around, but it wasn't the kind of commercial core of the genre that I was reading, really. And so I kind of wanted fantasy that was in that mould. And then I read A Game of Thrones, George R. R. Martin. Have you familiar? Not, don't know it. I think it'll be successful one day. There's the potential there, definitely. I'll give him a leg up, hopefully. And so I read Game of Thrones, and that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, because I felt, okay, you can do really classic fantasy in a classic fantasy world, but still have something that's shocking and surprising and dark and very character focused. And so that was the kind of work that I wanted to do, I guess.
And I think you went even darker on the Best Served Cold that Saidadeemergencia published has. What's the title in Portuguese?
Vingança Serve-se Fria.
Exactly. So I think that's even darker than the trilogy, the original trilogy, because, well, it's vengeance.
It
from
is.
Starts to finish.
Yeah, and I think I kind of decided to try and push it as far as I could with that book, perhaps, in terms of unlikable characters.
All characters are hateful.
They're filth.
Very much indeed.
They're despicable. And there's a couple who start a bit better, but then they quickly go downwards.
Yeah, there is one, how is it called? The Shivers?
Shivers.
It's
Yeah.
kind of goodish at the beginning, but he goes down that ramp very
He's
fast.
destroyed and corrupted by
Yeah.
the events, yeah, absolutely. I suppose the central character kind of is somewhat improved, or at least we learn a bit more about her, so she's slightly redeemed.
I think you more or less justify her actions. Redeem, I'm not sure.
Yeah, redeem's maybe a bit strong.
And did you have any negative feedback? Did some of the readers?
I've had lots of negative feedback. You would not believe the negative feedback I've had. Is there any negative feedback I haven't had?
Bad because of it, or no?
No. I mean, I think what I'd really hate to have is no reaction at all. I think very negative feedback is natural for anything that tries to do anything, that tries to push the boundary at all in any way. There'll always be people who kind of react badly. You know, if you deliberately set out to do something that's even a little bit dangerous or unpleasant in one way or another, or that shakes up expectations, you know, then there'll be people who don't get what they expected. It's like when you reach for a can of Coke and drink, and then you don't realise someone put a cigarette out in it a little while before, and you get the cigarette butt in your mouth. That's the feeling that the reader has.
And I feel that now, if you had good characters that only did good, that only acted, you'll have negative feedback for the other people.
Yeah, exactly. And you create your own expectations as you go. And sorry.
Let me pick your brain a little bit, because I'm also a small author.
Right.
What in your take away the dark things and the despicable things, which are actually fascinating, but take it away. What for you makes a character
There's nothing
work?
left now.
But what makes a character work for you?
I mean, I think if I'm reading other people's books, what I react to is a really strong voice and a sense of the person. You know, a strong authorial voice, I suppose. So what I want is to read a book that is written in a way I could never write myself. You know, that is sort of represents a way of thinking about the world, a style, a kind of conversational style that I could never come up with. I want to hear from someone who's not like me, and I want to hear a kind of, often that comes back to a sense of humour, a kind of unique sense of humour that I could otherwise never get. So that the things I really respond to are that uniqueness of voice.
How about the scenes? What does make a scene work for you?
It's tough because there's so many kinds of scenes and so many different things you might be aiming for. You know, if it's an action scene, you want a sense of involvement. I suppose I'm always trying to put the reader in the head of the character, and a lot of the fantasy I read when I was younger is quite detached. There's quite a narrative distance. The narrator is kind of above, describing events.
Well, I heard Brandon Sanderson say 40% of the people just skip the action because if you do it tit for tat. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Well, it's not that interesting unless you're with the characters, right?
Isn't it?
So you want to be in the heads of the characters, and you're trying to get across what their experience is, what their feelings are. So in terms of it's an action scene, I'm not very interested in the technicalities of what's happening. I'm not very interested in the grand overall picture. I'm interested in the individual experience of what's happening. And if that's someone looking down on a battle, then maybe you can get an overall picture of it. But really, I'm much more interested in what does it feel like to be punched in the face, more than anything. Not the technical. Keep it personal.
Okay.
Yeah.
You've been writing about the first love for, 2 decades? Does it get
2,000 years now.
2,000 years
like,
now,
yeah.
I'm sure. Does it get easier now, or is it harder? And since you've known, I'm sure that your characters have been changing, and you introducing new characters. But do you let them run wild now more than you did?
I mean, I've always tried to let them run wild, I think. Maybe a little more than I did. I think it doesn't get easier. It kind of, an individual series I find gets easier to write. So when I wrote the First Law, the first book took me 2 or 3 years to write, obviously spending a lot of time experimenting, going over and over things, rewriting things. And then the second book I wrote within a year and a half, maybe, much, much quicker. I had the voices of the characters there. I was getting much more experience with writing generally, knew much more what I wanted to do, and the plot was much more defined. So I was kind of, the machine was up and running, moving fast. The third book I wrote in, I think, a year, and it was the longest book I'd written till that time, and I was just flying through it, and I thought, I've cracked this. I've nailed it. My next book will take 6 months. The one after will take 6 weeks. And then I'll be doing them, weekly and having 6 days off, I thought. And in fact, when I came to write a fourth book, new characters, new setting, totally different. Immediately lost confidence, didn't know what I was doing. It was like typing with gloves on. And so you only really learn to write the book you're writing, has been my experience. Some are easier than others, but they're generally pretty horrible to write.
What's the wildest idea for a story you ever had?
I mean, I don't really have ideas. I don't have loads of ideas for books. I don't have loads of ideas queued up, waiting. I kind of had one idea, and I did that. And then I was left thinking, my editor came to me when I was writing the third book and said, "What are you doing next?" And I had this horrifying realization, like, oh my God, I keep going after this. You don't think past the end of one big trilogy. And so then I had to think of other ideas, and I kind of worked those up one by one. So I kind of have one idea at a time, largely. I mean, I had a very stupid idea recently, and I'm currently writing that, so that is a pretty weird, stupid idea.
Okay, you can talk about it? It's better not.
Well, I described it to someone else, and they said, so it's like a kind of papal suicide squad? And I said, no, it's not. Oh, yeah, no, it is. It is kind of like that. So it's kind of a papal suicide squad. The Pope keeps a load of monsters in the basement to deal with the problems that the righteous can't tackle. Yeah, and it's in a kind of stupid nonsense version of Europe, which means I don't have to do any research. That's the big advantage of it.
So it's a historical novel, is it?
It's a staunchly ahistorical novel, yeah. So I try to avoid anything historical so no one can accuse me of being wrong. It has a kind of, there's a female messiah instead of a male one, and so there's a female priesthood, and so there's a female pope. It's really stupid. There's a Carthaginian empire instead of a Roman one because the Romans lost the Punic Wars. It's that sort of thing.
Alternate history a little bit.
Well, that's giving it way too much dignity. It's not nearly as well thought out as that.
How many novels you've published until now?
I've published 12 novels and a collection of short stories. Yeah.
Okay, and it's always fantasy.
It is, though of different kinds, but yeah, it is, absolutely.
Do you plan to change the genre sometimes? Your editor is not asking you for a young adult or a new adult or...
Well, I suppose the Three Shattered Sea books are kind of young adult in a way.
Yeah.
But they're very much fantasy books. I think there's a kind of momentum you get when you get some success where your publisher really wants more of the same thing, generally, or more of something similar. They want to be able to sell to the readers you've already got. And you don't want to, write a book that you know is going to sell less.
Because many authors do change, and then the sales suffer a lot.
It certainly can happen. And, people write under different names in order to not sort of pollute the existing brand, as it were.
And you wouldn't do that, change the name and try something different.
If I wrote a lot, if I wrote 3 books a year, then yeah, absolutely. Because, you can only probably sustain a book a year under one name. If I was that productive...
Unless you're called James Patterson.
Unless you're called James Patterson. Well, he gets away with it, doesn't he? Only child. But generally speaking, I don't write enough to justify that. I don't write enough to Joe Abercrombie books, really.
And you imagined yourself for the next... you are a young guy.
Very young.
You imagined yourself...
Fresh new voice in the genre.
You imagine the next 20, 30 years, you're still writing fantasy, finding new plots.
Yeah. Well, that is a worry. How many books do you have in you? I think, I do worry about that. And every time I start a new book, I think, is this the really bad one? And generally, I think, yes, this is the really bad one when I'm writing it. And then I get to the end, I think, thank God, I got away with it. This can be made
So the
to work.
pressure is still there, right?
The pressure's there. Yeah, I mean, the pressure gets worse, if anything. I mean, the more success you have. Well, it's a different kind of pressure. If you're relatively successful, there's a kind of pressure of expectation from the publisher and from the readers, and, you want people to like what you do, of course, and you want what you do to be successful. And there's always that pressure to keep selling more units each time.
If you were starting right now, would you do anything differently?
I would not start. No. I'm not sure. It's really hard to say. I mean, because the books that I wrote, the First Law was very much a product of its time, and it kind of happened at the right moment. I think that book now would be a lot less interesting than it was then, perhaps. It kind of landed at the right moment. And when I was reading other things, comparing it to other things in the marketplace, I thought, this seems kind of weird, this book. It seems a weird mixture of humour and violence, and it's kind of horrible, and is it funny? I don't know. It seemed weird. It didn't really fit in the marketplace very well. But I think things had been edging in that direction for a while, and so it kind of was published at exactly the right time. I think if it was published now, it would be, who knows what would happen. Would it do anything different? No, what can you do different? But let's write what you want to write.
I've heard stories about young authors that go to agents, and the agents just tell them, well, you can't publish anything unless you already have 10,000 followers in your Instagram, or because publishers won't pick you up. Do you feel you'd have to do something like that? Do you feel that's easy, that's difficult?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's always a place for the right book at the right time. I mean, publishers are always looking for books, right? I mean, if the perfect book lands on your desk, you try and publish it. And you can't always manage it because there's commercial things to consider. There's a publishing meeting to get it passed. There's marketing people who you have to talk to. But I think publishers are still looking for the right book. So if the right book lands on the desk, it doesn't matter how many Twitter followers you've got. It may be that for 5 or 7 or 9 out of 10 authors, they need something that fits the bill, that is the right kind of book at the right moment. But in the end, if an editor just loves that writing, they're going to try and publish that book still, I think. But, what do I know?
Andrew, what do you think of self-publication and vanity presses and that thing that did not exist, 20 years ago?
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
I mean, I think it's great if there's more routes to market, really. I don't think there's any harm in it at all. When I was first trying to get published, I tried to find an agent first. That was the sort of advice at the time. And so I submitted to a few agents who published similar kinds of work or represented similar kinds of authors. and got rejected by all of them. And so I started thinking, how am I going to go about this if, I can't find anyone interested in publishing? And so we thought a bit. My parents had been involved in publishing a little, educational publishing. So we thought a bit about how we might try and do that. And at that time, you would literally have to get a few thousand books printed and try and get book reps to take them into bookshops and sell them by hand, in effect. That was self-publishing then. And so Amazon and ebooks have obviously transformed that, at least in the English-speaking world, and created this route where it's very, very possible to have big success as a self-published author and to do it yourself. But I think, people forget that it's self-publishing. It's publishing. If you're going to self-publish, you are your own publisher. You're not just a writer. You've got to do all that work. You don't just drop it onto Amazon and count the money. The people who are successful at doing that are taking the art very seriously. They've often got marketing skills or publishing skills or business skills of some kind, and they do it very seriously. And it's a lot of work. So I think it's a great avenue for some people with the right skills and for some books. It doesn't work for everyone, but it's great there's that option there. And, publishers often pick up self-published authors these days. So it's all just an additional part of the ecosystem, I guess. I've been, in the business 20 years now nearly, or I was published nearly 20 years ago, which is horrifying to think. So I'm a total dinosaur now. I don't really know what the right answer is. And for every author, there's a different route to market anyway. Everyone who's published has got there a different way. So who knows what the answer is?
Faça like, subscreva, partilhem e comentem. Sejam épicos.
Okay.
The fantasy, now moving to the genre, fantasy has been traditionally rooted or inspired by the past and even the distant past. Do you feel that fantasy has something to tell us about our current events, about what our future is going to be, or is it a way to escape what we're living?
I think it depends on the book, and there's no right answer. I like things that have some comment to make, but I don't start there, certainly. For me, you start with the characters, the situation, and then see what emerges. The last 3 books that I wrote, The Age of Madness, they were about an industrial revolution. I like periods of upheaval and things changing very rapidly. And so the Industrial Revolution seemed like an interesting sort of period to tackle. It's a period where there's lots of natural tensions between rich and poor, between kind of new money and old money, between innovation and sort of...
You had to do some research?
Yeah, a little bit. But only nice kind of research where you read stuff and you take what you like. You don't have to be accurate.
Okay. Because when you write a historical novel, usually if you want to write a good historical novel, you have to do a lot of research.
A lot.
When you write fantasy, it seems, it's so easy, I don't have to do research. But you do have to make some research, right? Because otherwise, your fantasy world is much more boring than reality.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I read a lot of history and do a lot of research of that kind. Not to make things accurate, but looking for things that are interesting or exciting or give you some kind of insight into the world. And truth is stranger than fiction in that sense. Reality is full of amazing facts and things that can help you add colour to it.
How do you build your world building? How do you start?
I suppose I start by not doing it, ideally. Start with the people, and then fill in the world building where you really have to, as far as their perception goes. So
it's the bottom up.
Bottom up,
yeah.
Absolutely. Start with the people, start with the story, and then worry about the world later. Yeah.
How about message? I do believe that it's impossible to write a good book without a message, even if it's subtle or implicit or explicit in some way. Do you ever think about the message in your books, or not at all?
As little as I can, I suppose, or at least that's something that kind of...
What do you think is the message of your books?
I don't know. That's not for me to say in a way. I write them and other people can decide what message to draw from them, I guess. And often it's something that develops as you go. You know, you write a book, like the heroes say, I wanted to write the story of a single battle and follow various characters within it at various different positions on both sides, different levels in the chain of command.
Is it something like Pedro was saying, that there's no good people in the world?
Is that the message?
Yeah.
No.
What am I thinking?
No, I don't think that's the message at all. I think everyone's lovely is the message.
The idea was there is no absolutely good people in the world. Everybody is black and white, gray, most of it. No one's just white or just black.
Yeah, I think it's that. And the goodness is a lot of work. And most people don't ever really get there. Most people can't be bothered. You know, it's not easy, I think, is if there's a message. But the heroes, you know, was about a battle, and then it turned out to be about war and about heroism more generally, and whether it's possible to be heroic and what being heroic really looks like. You know, so
I'm going to make a question that we probably have to cut later on the podcast. No, I'm just kidding. Society is living a turmoil because of the diversity question, the LGBT rights, and we watch all the changes and the repercussions on television and movies and the cancellations. And this is affecting the books. Many authors are publishing now because of all this. They have new opportunities, or they have to change a little bit their characters. They have to be more sensible. We are 5 guys here. We should put a girl here.
5 white guys.
That's 10 years ago, we wouldn't even think about it. But now, hey, we should put more diversity in the table. Do you have that problem now? Do you think a little bit?
Before you answer, I was actually talking with Flip about that a few moments ago. And yeah, you have all kinds of extremist activism all over the world, and not so extremist, it depends. But you have people just picking up a message and coming to the streets and, I don't know, protesting about COVID or the hijab or migration, whatever. There's this feeling of tension and of activism in the world, and that has to come out in the books one way or another, I believe. But we were thinking, good books do it in a sophisticated, subtle way, don't they? What do you think?
Sophisticated and subtle is what I'm known for, obviously. Well, I mean, The Age of Madness was a little bit about, you know, it touches on some of those things. I mean, Brexit was a big thing in the UK, you may be aware.
Yeah.
How we've
it's
taken back control.
Very fine, I heard.
We're all very happy with how it's going. very delighted. Yeah, it's been brilliant.
The publishing industry loves it.
Absolutely, I can see that. But, you know, that experience of seeing how things worked politically, that all went into those books. And you're right, you can't avoid being affected by what's going on at the time. And I don't think you want to avoid it. You know, you may be talking about then, in a way, when you're writing fantasy, but really we are modern authors talking to a modern audience. So it's a little bit ridiculous to pretend that we're not affected by what's happening in the world and that we don't think anything about what's happening in the world. And I think any book that, you know, tackles issues seriously is going to take some kind of position on those things up to a point. It's hard to avoid. I don't think you want to avoid it. But, you know, for me, I don't kind of necessarily make it the first port of call.
Yeah, but you do have very strong female characters in your books.
Try to in the more recent ones. I think, you know, partly as a result of the first 3 books, they're a bit of a sausage fest, it's been said.
Yeah, more or less, but then you have how's she called?
I mean, I'm very pleased with the female characters in those books, both of them.
Both, yeah. Okay, true.
But it's a big set of books with a lot of characters. And, you know, I think I read a lot of fantasy as a kid, as I was saying, and in those books there's a lot of male characters. You know, you look at Lord of the Rings, pretty male. You know, The Hobbit, is there a female character in The Hobbit? I think there might be like an innkeeper or something at one point. The dragon, maybe, yeah, is unclear. So, you know, in trying to tackle a load of fantasy archetypes, they're male archetypes, you know, they're the warrior, the boy with a special destiny, the old wise wizard, those things. Those are the kind of things I was tackling without really thinking about it.
And that's why you have the woman that kills all the men?
Well, partly, perhaps. I mean, when I've written those 3 books, I thought, man, I could have done better.
Well, Vingança Serve-se Fria, the book the latest book we published, it's about a female hero. Okay.
Hero, yeah.
Not really a hero, the
Female
anti-hero.
Yeah.
But it's a
Yeah, but
great
you do
character.
something very interesting that most authors don't do. You start with a beautiful female character, then she gets thrown from a tower and she breaks all her bones or whatever, and then she goes through most of the book, not that beautiful, but it's still very attractive anyway.
You are sick, man. I don't know se alguém queira fazer alguma pergunta, põe um só o dedo no ar, faz em português ou em inglês e a gente... Então, força. Some questions from the audience.
Yeah. Hello.
Olá, estou a tentar iniciar-me enquanto autora.
Don't do it. Don't do it. It's not too late for you.
Já tenho alguns manuscritos, mas têm sido totalmente ignorados pelas editoras e agentes literários. Então, que dicas tem para dar a alguém que está a tentar começar neste meio?
Well, I mean, as I was saying, it's a long time since I was published, so I definitely don't have the answers for the modern audience. And I think, I take it you're writing in Portuguese, writing in English. So I think the best advice is understand the market as much as you can. Don't worry about where the market is. Write what you love and are inspired by, and try and write a book that you really like without worrying too much about the audience. This was my approach anyway. And then think very carefully about who you send it to and prepare the approaches as carefully as you can. Write a very, very good letter that explains why this is a book that they have to publish and can't miss.
And
why it's so good.
You recommend short fiction or long fiction?
I don't myself, because I think it's a bit of a waste of time, if I'm completely honest.
Short fiction?
Yeah.
For the magazines, for the literary magazines, genre
I think it's
magazines?
quite a dated approach to writing, if I'm
Okay.
honest. I mean, I think it's great practice.
Yeah, for practice, for example.
I think it's great practice to develop what you're doing, and if I had any sense, that's what I'd have started off doing. But, you know, you've got to write what you love. And what I loved was huge, big, ridiculous, long trilogies. And so that's what I set out to try and write straight away, which is probably quite stupid. But the market for short fiction is just not very good. So I would, by all means, practice if you feel inspired to write short stuff. But long stuff is where the profession is at, really, on the whole. Is any of that any use at all? Be honest is what my mum always says.
Acha que é mais difícil começar hoje ou há 20 anos?
No, it was much harder when I did it. Those were the tough days. Yeah, I was a real crusader, a real trailblazer. It was. You lot don't know how easy you've got it now. No, I mean it probably is harder. I don't know. It's there's a huge appetite for a much greater range of stuff. I think now, fantasy as a genre is way wider and has all kinds of different work in it, which is great.
Porque parece que há tantas regras, o que torna as coisas frustrantes.
I mean, when you say rules, what kind of thing?
Coisas como o número de palavras, o comprimento dos capítulos, é frustrante.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always kind of fascinated by that because people will say that agents won't look at anything over 80,000 words or 100,000 words or whatever. And of course, there's if you look at Brandon Sanderson, say, he sells a couple of books, he shifts a unit or two, but he writes big-ass books, and always has. And I write pretty long books and always have. And I was published in the same year as Scott Lynch, Tom Lloyd, and then Pat Rothfuss was a year after. Peter Brett was, I think, a year after. But Brent Weeks, all those guys were around the same time, all writing huge books. But it may well be that the huge book white guy market is somewhat saturated by the existing huge book white guys. So for people coming in to the market, they're looking for something slightly different. And I guess, publishers will have a better idea than me of what the market can stand and why they want those things. But shorter books are cheaper to produce, and there's a certain discipline that is demonstrated by delivering a shorter, tighter book. So that may be why they're looking for those things. But I would say if you're submitting to someone, follow the rules they've got, because otherwise you'll probably go straight in the bin before. As much as anything, it's for them to slim it down to people who can do what they're told, at least to begin with.
Ok. Mais alguma pergunta? Estejam à vontade, senão nós continuamos a fazer as nossas. People are shy.
They are.
Fala baixinho para
The man with the child, the sleeping child.
Existem alguns planos para uma adaptação da primeira lei? Já falou com alguém, ainda que informalmente? Acha que seria benéfico para a sua obra?
I've had lots of conversations about it with my wife, other people. There've been some successful adaptations recently of fantasy. I understand. I don't watch it myself. I take no notice of that stuff. So anyone who's got a reasonably successful series will have had some conversations with some people, I would think. And I've had some conversations with some people. Sad conversations. And so I've been kind of working on some of that stuff for years. But you kind of have to let that do its thing and not take it too seriously. If it happens, it happens. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. There's not a huge amount you can do yourself. You try and get the right people involved and, sell the rights to the right people. But it's a bit of a crapshoot in the end. So, maybe something will happen one day, but don't hold your breath, would be my advice.
One question precisely for the upcoming writers who are watching us. What is your process from inception to actual book? I've heard a lot of people say, don't waste your time revising, just go over your the first thing that you wrote, and if you spend a lot of time revising, you're wasting time because you should be working on your next book. Would you agree with that? What's your process?
No, I would not. I would reject it. I would fling it in the teeth of whoever said that. I don't know. I mean, I think the bottom line is whatever works for you. There's no one way, and the best advice is just something to try, and see if it works. I revise a lot. When I first started, all I did was revise, really. I'd go over and over and over things. I was a TV editor before I was a writer, and in that job you go over and over and over sequences and slim them down, revise them, redo them, reshape them.
But you write a rough sketch, and you write all the novel, and then you restart and start working on what you have, or you try to write the thing as you...
It depends. It depends. I mean, when I started, I would write a paragraph, then revise it, write another paragraph, then revise them both. When I started work one evening, I'd look at what I did last night and revise that. And I think that gave me, that's how I developed the skills in the first place, really, how I kind of worked out how to pace a scene, how to give a character a voice. And for me, the voice of the characters refine as you work on a book, and as you get through a book towards the end, you get a better and better idea of who they are and what they need to be, how they talk, how they think. So the revising is kind of the essential thing for me. And, when I finish a draft, I then go through several times, revising it with different things in mind, and look at the characters and try and get them as unique as I can, and then the settings, and think about the weather, and think about the temperature, and think about the light in the rooms, and that kind of thing to, make everything as individual as I can. So really, my first draft is even worse than the finished book. It's not great. And then I spend a lot of time revising down and kind of find the book hiding in the first draft, I suppose.
And you have to rewrite large portions sometimes?
I suppose generally I'm not rewriting heavily, and I'm not cutting huge scenes. Maybe I'm adding a scene or two here or there if I feel there's something that needs to be developed or that I missed.
You have better readers?
I have some, yeah.
What is the importance of
readers, right? Alpha readers is while you're writing, right?
Is it?
There's two kinds. There are alpha readers while you're writing, beta readers when you have to finish draft before publishing.
I've got a bit of both, but mostly alpha. I mean, so I go through, I write part by part. So this book I'm writing now is split into 4 parts, for example, and so I'll write the first part. I think about it, I plan it, and then I write that first part, and then I'll send it to them, which is usually my parents, who are brutal, savage. They're absolute savages. And my editor as well, my UK editor. And so she reads the first part when I do that, and then we have a kind of conversation about what's working, what's not. And I've probably got some ideas myself about what's working and what's not, how it needs to change. And then I plan the second part with that in mind. And then when I finish that, I send it to them, they read it, we discuss it. And that's how we kind of go all the way through. And obviously by the time I reach the last part, hopefully everyone's had quite a lot of input already. My editor knows what's working, what's not, has had some, input from the commercial point of view as well. So when I get to the end of the book, everyone's got a pretty good idea how it needs to be rewritten and changed to get to a reasonably coherent second draft. That's the idea. So, yeah, beta readers all the way through. It's nice to have some input from other people because it can be quite a lonely thing just sitting there struggling with the words, It's nice to have some other people to talk to about it.
Yeah. And that's interesting because each writer has a different way of working, and we all here write, I think, more or less, and I have that problem. I'm always revising what I'm writing. Sometimes I would just want to write a first time and never return back until I'm reach the end of the book and then revise it again. Always stuck revising, improving, and I'm not sure it's the best way. But some writers, very good writers, work like that, and it works for them. So,
I mean, this latest set of books I wrote, The Age of Madness, I, deliberately went through a first draft very quickly because I wanted to write all 3 books together before we published the first one. So I knew what the end would be, and I could then go back and really revise the first book in detail and get it as right as I could. And that was great in some ways, because I was economical in the time.
Yeah, and you see the things going forward. Right?
Yeah, and you know what the whole shape of it is, which is useful. But at the same time, you kind of it's difficult to get confident and happy with what's there already. If you revise a lot as you're going, you maybe feel like you're on solid ground. I've got solid chapters there that I feel good about, and that's nice too. So it depends on what I'm writing and how how it feels right.
Okay, I think we have to close this up. One last question, Luis?
Yeah, I really understand what you're feeling or what you're saying because I usually hate what I write the first time, and it's sometimes an effort to overcome that feeling. And I was quite taken when I read your latest progress report when you said you just finished the first part of your latest novel and you had hated doing it. Yeah. So I kind of related to that. How do you overcome that step? Is it just a matter of discipline? Or deadlines, perhaps?
I think experience is really helpful because you don't learn to do it better, but you learn that it's always horrible. So when it's horrible, you think, it was horrible last time as well, so maybe this will be okay in the long run. You see the light at the end of the tunnel because it's been there before. So you learn at least that much, and I suppose if I've learned anything, it's just not to panic too badly. But I do definitely get into, get very down on what I'm doing and think this is rubbish, this is not going to work.
And when you're doing that, there's one thing that I was, as I started to meet more and more authors, I got that there's what I call the caesura effect, which is when people start getting to the end of the book, it starts getting heavier and more difficult to go until it's actually finished. You've suffered for something like that?
No, the middle's the problem I have.
Okay.
Yeah, the middle, definitely. But by the time I get towards the end, hopefully then I'm thinking, okay, I know what I'm doing now. That's usually what happens. I'll kind of, the first quarter goes well because it's exciting and new. And you're trying new things, you're trying new ideas, and you're thinking, wow, I'm excited to do this.
But you get that anxiety that very soon the book is going to meet the public and going to go doing its own path and
can't wait to get rid of it. Oh, okay. Can't wait to get rid of it by that point. You want to get it out the door, or at least that's what I find. I think when I get towards the end, I start feeling, now I can go back to the start and rewrite and turn it into something that's hopefully good. So that I look forward to. That's the bit I enjoy, really, is the revising and the going over and the feeling that I can now get it off my desk. I love my finished books. They're wonderful books. It's the ones I'm writing at the time that I despise, it's hard work. Yeah.
Well, we have to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Joe, for being here with us. Obrigado, Pedro, pela ajuda, primeiro editor aqui do Joe Abercrombie. E muito obrigado a todos. Aqui, Comic Con, esta parceria entre a Comic Con e o BANGCAST. Podem nos procurar no YouTube, em todas as plataformas de podcast. 15 em 15 dias falamos de alguma coisa. A revistabang acabou, está quase a sair, está quase aí uma a arrebentar a 32 na FNAC, estejam atentos. Aí, olha, obrigado, tenham uma boa Comic Con, um abraço e até à próxima.
Thanks.